I appreciate everyone joining today. And for an introduction on myself, I'm Alex Newman, the Director of Partnerships at Boon. Excited to welcome you all to today's conversation around transforming employee development. For anyone who isn't already familiar with Boon, Boon is a personalized coaching platform. So we partner with companies to provide scalable and affordable development opportunities that are hyper-personalized to the growth objectives of their workforce. And we do all this via one-on-one coaching. And I think what prompted today's discussion is in our fast-paced workplaces, many traditional approaches to employee growth seem to be missing the mark. Companies are pouring resources into perks and wellness apps, but I think we're hearing a lot of these short-term fixes aren't tackling the root issues. I even loved an analogy that one of our panelists, Alex Seiler, shared the other day. A lot of companies are building their development strategies on quicksand, confusing activity with true progress. So in many of these strategies, things like annual reviews are often kind of reduced to checkboxes and development plans, which were intended to guide growth, but these are frequently becoming irrelevant and more disconnected from the real business needs. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Alex Seiler, who's served in various HR and people functions throughout his career, as well as Emmanuelle Gounot, a seasoned business leader with experience working across numerous functions within scaling businesses. Emmanuelle also happens to be one of Boon's amazing coaches. And so as we dive into the fundamental reasons why current growth systems fall short and kind of talk through what we can do to fix them. By the end of this discussion, we hope that you'll all walk away with some actionable insights into rebuilding a development system that really truly supports your people and also that better aligns with your company's mission. So with that said, would love to start by doing some more formal introductions of our panelists. So Emmanuelle, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Alex, for having me today. So I'm French-born. I've lived and worked across 3 continents. Now back in the U.S. after an overseas assignment. I was in Vietnam for the past 4 years, serving as CEO of Intrepid in Vietnam, which is a digital marketing and e-commerce agency. And a fast-growing one. I spent most of my career leading teams across functions, driving revenue and profitability in product-backed businesses, including Amazon, Lazada, which is now part of Alibaba, as well as Uber. And Lazada and Uber are obviously both big organizations. However, joining them a while back, they were still going through a lot of changes, and we saw that the employee growth infrastructure was still rather rudimentary at that time. And I'm very passionate about the topic of professional development, so very excited for today's discussion.
Thanks, Emmanuelle. And Alex, do you want to go next?
Sure. Too many Alexes on one call. So I'm Alex Seiler. My background is I'm a little bit all things diversity and global. So I'm half British and half Swiss. And I was born and raised in Hong Kong. So I've lived in many different continents like Emmanuelle has as well. And I've been in the US for the last 20 years. I've been in the people and HR space for 20 years. And the arc of my career has been going from big multinationals to small, mid-sized businesses to now working with a lot of startups. So diversity of size of business and also very different industries over that period of time. I also advise for startups all in the HR technology space. And, this topic is very near to dear to my heart. I probably don't need to say why now since Alex used one of my analogies about this. But I will say that, I think some of the actions that are being taken around this topic have become a little performative. They have the right intention, but there's no real execution behind them. And so I think I'm looking forward to today's conversation to hopefully leave all of you with some ideas around some key takeaways and what could actually drive more outcomes as well.
Love it. Well, thank you both for the introductions. And again, thank you for joining us today. And I think we can dive right in. And I think, Emmanuelle, you have a really interesting perspective because you've worked at some of these large organizations, like you mentioned, Uber, Alibaba, but also understanding when you joined those organizations and the rapid growth that was associated with that. So from those leadership roles at Uber and Alibaba, what challenges did you observe in building and maintaining effective growth and development programs while the company was scaling so quickly? And how did those traditional models fall short in these environments?
Sure. So I think that maybe going back to what those businesses were going through at the time, there was a lot of change. If I look at Lazada, Alibaba, back in the day, the business was going through hyper growth. Teams were literally doubling overnight, and all of the HR energy and focus was spent on daily HR operations as well as recruiting to meet the very urgent needs of the business. If I look at Uber, when I joined in 2017, so that was pre-IPO, and the business was going through, I would say, an existential challenge in terms of shifting the organizational design from a city-run business to a more centralized organization. And so there were a lot of challenges that came with that as well. And so in both cases, any sort of professional development framework that had been put together by the HR team often felt outdated just because the needs of the business were evolving so quickly. And so even something as basic as competencies for each role was something that was actually very difficult to create and maintain, just based on constant change in the business. So that was, I would say, one of the primary challenges at the time, to see how do we hire the right people, how do we do good performance evaluations, and how do we create development plans if we don't have even that part in place, quite honestly.
Totally. Yeah. It's kind of sets the framework for a lot of the talent infrastructure when you have or don't have those. So, and Alex Seiler, I would be curious, like as you have kind of navigated these different stops in your career and especially as your time as a chief people officer, what do you see as the systematic issues in traditional growth frameworks, and how do these issues become even more apparent when you're in one of those rapidly scaling, fast-growing organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think part of the challenge or the problem is that we focused too narrowly on things like vertical progression and not really considered what lateral progression looks like, and also standardized metrics, which, I think are failing to account for things like cross-functional skills and diverse career paths. So I think in high growth organizations, these limitations really become highlighted or magnified as you start to rapidly scale. And in situations like that, you need greater role flexibility and faster skill development as well. There's a velocity that comes with that. So I think the frameworks typically lag behind the organizational needs, and they struggle to really evaluate emerging roles. And they also, like I said, don't think about how you can support horizontal growth or more niche expertise as well. So I think that's where you start seeing talent retention issues and maybe incentives going the wrong way. So particularly when companies need to evolve even faster than established career ladders can adapt. Because, in the past, like, it was just a success to put together a career ladder. But by the time it came out, like, the skills need and the growth and development had changed so much. So usually there's a lag that happens behind that.
Yep. It's an interesting point too about the horizontal movement too. I think so many people are focused on upwards mobility, but I think that's an interesting dynamic that probably gets missed by a lot of organizations.
Well, and I will just add that, like, I think a common question I always ask when I'm interviewing, particularly HR folks, is when they say, like, I'm looking for growth in my career, I'm like, tell me what that looks like to you, because growth means so many different things to so many different people. Some of it's incentives, some of it's development, some of it. So it's like really honing in on what that looks like as well.
Totally. And also, before my next question, I forgot to mention at the start, if anyone has questions throughout, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. If it's kind of ties into what we're talking about, we can jump in real time, and otherwise we'll save some time at the end to go through questions. But yeah, and Alex, I think a follow-up too is, like, in terms of your experience and how companies implement flexible yet effective development models that really keep up with the demands of a fast-scaling organization. Like, how do they do that? And are there specific strategies or principles you recommend to keep employee growth aligned with the company's growth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it goes back. I think for me, I'm all about practical, and I think practical takeaways and strategies. So a couple things that I think can work in order for these models to become effective, especially for fast scaling organizations, is taking real-time learning approaches, right? So what does that mean? So I think micro-learning is really important, like having micro-learning modules that you can like tap into, right? Because they immediately address any sort of work challenges you may be facing. Think about doing sort of weekly skill building sessions as part of your team meetings, right? So you're all kind of learning together at the same time. I think doing actual job shadowing during projects that are going on, right? Then I think also like flexibility, especially in all the environments that we work in, is so key, right? Especially knowing that some of us are remote first, some of us are hybrid, some of us in person. So things like doing a project-based evaluation of annual reviews, right? Or, skills demonstration through actual deliverables, I think those things become really important as well. And then the other one that I think I always highlight is manager enablement, right? Like, because we talked about manager enablement a lot. It's something that hasn't gone away. So how can you think about weekly, providing sort of weekly coaching conversation templates, or real-time feedback tools and frameworks, or regular calibration sessions to align standards. Those are some of the things that I think are going to be sort of really important. And then the other one I've thought about too is career path innovation, because that's something we touched on, like how career ladders become sort of not obsolete, but not of the time the moment you start using them. So how can you think about project or initiative leadership opportunities, or specialist roles with deep expertise focus, or cross-functional career moves that come with training, right? I think all of these things are things that really can help grow fast and scaling organizations from a development standpoint.
And I think there's a lot in there, but I think one thing that stood out to me is you mentioned shadowing, and it's interesting, like when I reflect on my own career, when you start at a company, shadowing is highly encouraged. That's kind of how you develop those on-the-job skills and real-time learnings. But then once you get past that onboarding phase, I feel like it's very uncommon or rare to see shadowing being emphasized across other aspects of the organization. With, again, it's such an easy way to accelerate those early learnings. So feels like there's a really large opportunity to extend that at other points of the employee life cycle. But
completely. And I think another one for me that's always been a big one is it's always brought up when you talk about succession planning, but it's never really implemented. I've heard people be like, well, I don't know if that person could do my job because they, and I'm like, well, there's going to be a learning curve like anything. But actually, if you start letting them shadow areas of your job that they don't have expertise in, then you can start closing the gap on those things as well. So, but then, again, that's something that is talked about when you put together a development plan, but then it quickly falls apart and becomes what I call digital dust, because then it's not actually implemented. So you have to have the follow through on these things. And like, I think the person who is basically receiving that developmental feedback and the manager need to be holding both of themselves accountable in those situations as well. Like, this isn't a one-sided affair. It's both sides that are equally accountable.
And I like digital dust. I may steal that one from. And Emmanuelle, in your experience, what approaches to employee development prove most successful? And do you have any specific initiatives or even coaching models that help empower employees and kind of keep up with the rapid pace of change that was transpiring across your organizations?
Sure. So I would say, so from my experience in fast-growing companies, so I would say the very first step was a very rigorous competency mapping for every single role, because as I mentioned before, I think that's really a foundation for a lot of the things that we will do later on. And that allows us to then have a more rigorous approach to performance management, to a diagnosis of where we fall short as an organization from a skill perspective, but also at the individual level, and identify areas of growth. So that can then be followed by hard skill training that should be developed, I would say, in tandem between the functional leaders and the HR team. Some of the things that I've seen also make an impact have been extend coaching for the C-suite. Sometimes as an organization grows very quickly, there can also be some a lot of great benefits in that. And so historically, that has started with the C-suite. What we see now is that there is an opportunity to bring that to other levels of the organization. And I'm sure this is something we'll talk about a bit more. What I've also seen work well at Alibaba, they were big fans of cross-functional projects, so on-the-job learning opportunities and rotations. And so, Alex, that ties in really, that experience ties in really well with what you were referring to in terms of the lateral moves within the organization. What we did at Alibaba is a lot of those projects were also sponsored by executive leadership. And so we had both the ability to pick up new skills, new counterparts in the organization, but also get some of that mentorship from senior leaders at the company. So that was something they absolutely loved. At Uber, what I've seen a lot as well has been some, I would say, soft skill trainings conducted by either leaders in the organization and as well as they also made an investment at some point in HBS virtual education across the organizations for all of those who were interested. And that's obviously a more material investment, but something that was very well received by many of the employees. There were also some ad hoc investments in soft skill trainings, workshops, group coaching. That was great in terms of employee morale and the engagement in these sessions. Often, it's hard to continue to see the benefits after the training and ensure that we continue to build on that in the day-to-day. So I think that's also something that needs to be thought about, how it all ties together in the end.
And sorry, can I just add to that? Like, I think something that Emmanuelle said that's important is also the executive buy-in is so key. But I also think what is critical is that they themselves are modeling those behaviors in the way that they are, again, going back to holding themselves accountable. Because it's one thing to like provide the financial support, but you actually have to be doing that like work yourself as well.
Yeah. And this is where I think this is too often I've seen people in the organizations almost be consumers of what's being maybe put out by human resources. And at the end of the day, this is not how it works, right? This needs to be a joint initiative where the business leadership is also involved in this. And this is important for buy-in, but just also to ensure that what's delivered really meets the needs of the organization and continues to be maintained over time.
Yeah, and I was starting to think as you were kind of sharing a bunch of those different initiatives, Emmanuelle, like if someone is starting from square one of building a strategy, like do you have kind of an order in which you would think about addressing some of those needs? Like understanding Alex's point about the need for senior leadership to be modeling this behavior and this mindset of growth and development. Does the executive coaching kind of start at the top of that list, or like where do you see the biggest priorities as someone's getting started?
So to me, that can be the executive coaching of the C-suite can be done in parallel. It doesn't have to be number one. I think it's often very helpful for those leaders to also hold themselves accountable to helping to steer some of these initiatives within the organization. And that helps them to role model some of the behaviors that they will later encourage. But the rest can also be done at the same time. It doesn't necessarily have to be sequential.
Yep, makes sense. And along those lines, in terms of coaching, which is obviously a topic that's near and dear to Boon's heart, I'm curious, like how did personalized coaching help employees at Uber and Alibaba navigate the unique challenges of being in an environment like that? And how can coaching support other high potential employees and leaders when rapid changes is kind of the norm in their business?
So I think so. Back in the day, to be completely candid, coaching was only just for executives at Alibaba back in the day, and I think at Uber it's now been launched more holistically with a lot more resources for employees across the organization. But that was much more of an ad hoc support to leaders who would most benefit from it at a time in place. What I would say, though, is that like through my own work with my team members, through my coaching with Boon, I really see the benefits of that personalized experience in the sense that we can provide a lot of project opportunities, on-the-job learning opportunities, but it's important to ensure that this does not become a source of overwhelm for the employee as well, right? And so there needs to be a little bit of I would say a multi-pronged approach where we're very clear about what is it that we're trying to achieve, what are the goals, what are the roadblocks that we need to address, and then pausing to also reflect on that learning as it is happening. Too often, I've seen people say that, oh, nothing is changing. They're not learning because they're so caught into action. And sometimes you just have to pause and see how much you've learned and draw on your experiences as part of that. So I'm a very strong believer in just slowing down to process learning. And I think that's also very important in terms of giving employees agency over their development and accountability moving forward as well.
And it is, I think that resonates with me of being in a fast-paced work environment where you're just kind of so consumed in what you're doing every day that sometimes when you take a step back and look at it from the 30,000-foot view, you really appreciate the growth and development that's occurred there. And so in the moment, sometimes that can feel frustrating, like what is next or how do I continue to improve in these areas? But that macro view kind of reframes a lot of what's happening in that time frame. So, and Alex, I'm curious, like obviously, getting a non-Boon perspective on this one, what is your view on personalized coaching in terms of how it's able to address the gaps left by these traditional systems that we're discussing, and especially for employees who are constantly adapting to new roles and responsibilities? Do you have examples where you've seen individualized coaching make a tangible impact on employee engagement or retention?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, to know me is to know that I appreciate context. And so that is something that I value so much with personalized coaching, especially during periods of rapid organizational change, right? Because you're moving so quickly that people don't really know what's going on. So having that context through personalized coaching, I think, is so important. And what's nice is, unlike some of the frameworks that are out there, which can be fairly rigid, coaching adapts in real time to different challenges and individual needs. So I think there is such for companies that aren't leveraging personalized coaching right now, it's such a missed opportunity, and it's something that I think needs more time and energy needs to be spent there and invested there. As far as an example goes, something more recent does come to mind. I worked with a fractional client, a tech startup, where an engineering manager was struggling with suddenly leading, and this is not like a rocket science example because it happens a lot, but suddenly leading a team of 20 people instead of 5. And so the focus then became on weekly coaching sessions focused on delegation and team structure, which helped them to adapt to those ever-changing, very quick-changing needs. And it actually resulted in them retaining 90% of their team during a period of hyper-growth, basically. So that's one that I feel like most recently really speaks to what you're asking about. And then I think all of this becomes like sort of moot if you can't really measure the impact of coaching and personalized coaching. So I think you need to look at a few things, regular one-on-one sessions that tie back to like the immediate challenges that you're dealing with. I think we've talked about digital development plans going to dust. The ones that actually are very action oriented and adjust to actual role changes, I think, are really important. Focusing on both the tactical as well as a leadership mindset, right? Because especially for high growth organizations, they're stuck in the weeds of both the operational, but also having to think strategically. I think having some sort of peer coaching network as that can help as you scale support is really important. And then just, integration with daily work rather than having separate programs is going to be really important. So I think what I love about coaching at the end of the day, it breeds so much flexibility and helps you address real-time challenges as they come up as well.
Yeah. And I think you bring up an interesting point in terms of like, obviously there's a ton of value of the personalization of coaching, but ultimately it is an investment that businesses are making in their employees. And I know that there are times where, especially if it's a conversation about extending coaching beyond the senior leadership level of the team, there can be questions around like, well, how are we seeing this translate to ROI for our business? And so I am curious to kind of piggyback off of that, Alex. Like, what are there metrics or indicators that you find most meaningful when you're measuring the impact of personalized coaching?
Yes, there are indeed. Like, I think, and there are different ones that speak to different organizations as well. So I think as far as when I think about, well, different areas, I think if I think about business, thinking about the business specifically, you may want to look at things like, internal promotion fill rate versus external hires, right? Time to productivity when you're in a new role. The cost saved from less external recruitment, right? Those are, I think, some important business metrics. I think from a growth and mobility standpoint, you can look at things like how quickly did people pick up new skills, like the skill acquisition, as well as your internal mobility rates and career path progression speed as well. And then I'm a big engagement person, looking at the engagement indicators. So I guess one thing would be, what does retention look like for coached employees versus people that didn't receive coaching, and employee satisfaction with growth opportunities, and also manager effectiveness scores. I think those are really big. And then, tying it back to an ROI, because everyone wants to make sure that there's the ROI that comes from it. And so I think one is just, calculating the cost savings from improved retention, and also, the productivity gains that come from post-coaching as well. So those are some that kind of stand out that I think are really important. And I think it's important to compartmentalize and look at them from different perspectives, whether it's business, growth, engagement. So you're getting a very well-rounded approach to it.
I wonder if there's something also to measure around the almost like the satisfaction of managers, right? In terms of how they're going through that. In the absence of personalized coaching, often a lot of that burden will fall on managers to support their teams. And when they're already stretched so thin, this can feel like a huge challenge, right? So there is an opportunity to, I would say, outside of personalized coaching, to maybe support managers with some of that toolkit, right, to help them, and also help to create some of these more organic or formal mentorship and informal coaching relationships or peer coaching relationships within the organization. But I think that today, one of the big challenges that many companies have is the overwhelm of many middle managers who have to, at the end of the day, are the ones on the line trying to support their team members.
Totally. And I think that goes back to kind of the disconnect that we've talked about earlier of the organizational goals, but how it's being, I guess, received and adapted by the employee population. And a lot of that ends up getting put back on the manager in those performance conversations and one-on-ones, where a lot of the development responsibilities, again, as you said, it needs to be a partnership. And oftentimes it probably feels overwhelming for those managers, where it can be a bit one-sided in some of those dynamics. We had a good question from the audience that I feel like is relevant to where we're at right now. The question is, what are the key differences in coaching needs for mid-level managers compared to senior leaders, especially in fast-paced environments? And how can personalized coaching contribute to building a pipeline of resilient and adaptable leaders from this group?
I'm happy to start. So I'd say, just to break that, so for mid-level managers, some of the things that I think they particularly need coaching on is team dynamics and delegation, understanding that all people are different, and how to motivate and delegate looks different. Cross-functional leadership, moving from tactical to strategic thinking, right? Because you're used to being an individual contributor who is just focused on the tactical. Now you need to start thinking more strategically, how to manage up effectively, and also balancing execution with development as well. So those are the ones for mid-level that I think is really important. For senior leaders, it's a little bit different because you're taking you've got a macro approach to the organization. So I think how do you have enterprise-wide impact is going to be really important. Change management is huge because you're involved in so many changes across the organization. strategic vision and alignment, and looking beyond just your department, but also more broadly against the organization. Executive presence, I think, is huge. And whether that's preventing you from getting certain other growth opportunities, and then dealing with what I call complex stakeholder management, and which is sometimes a little tricky to navigate. And then I think the last part of that question was also about like approaches for building pipeline. I think the things that come to mind most is first, learnings from actual business challenges, having more exposure to senior level decisions and context so that when you arrive in that seat, it's not such a sort of surprise that smacks you in the face. More structured mentorship from executives, and then more cross-functional project leadership. So I know I said a lot. Sorry, that's one. When I saw that question, I kind of got excited because I was like, I have a lot to say about this. So.
Emmanuelle, anything you want to add to that one?
I think Alex's response is pretty holistic. No, I mean, the only thing I would add, and maybe within communication, is something around storytelling. That's an important skill so in the organization. But I think that other than that, we covered it all. I think when it comes to delegation, there's also a realization that the more that if you want to take on more, you also need to delegate and empower others. I've seen too many people maybe sometimes stuck in a role because you're the only one that can do it. So understanding that being a single point of failure is not good, and that on the contrary will hold you back. And there's sometimes a little bit of coaching work and some tactics that can become very handy there for mid-level managers.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, and ones that I've come across in my career. Single points of failure really just hold you back as an organization, and people also, it leads to sort of silos and, just again, reliance on one person, and it's preventing the organization from sort of moving forward as well. So I think that's and storytelling as well. So I love those ads.
Yeah, and I even think like the last part of the question of building a pipeline of leaders. You talked about, Alex, the retention of employees and the cost savings is one of the metrics that companies can look at. But I think retention in and of itself is part of how you build a pipeline. If you're losing high potential or high quality individual contributors who are on that path to leadership before they get there, it's tough to build a pipeline. So again, maybe a simpler response, but I think that's part of it, is how do we invest in and continue to keep that high quality?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. And this goes back to like over time, if you're not taking actions around your high potential, like if you keep telling them things and then your actions don't support those words, then they're going to start getting fed up and start looking elsewhere because they're not going to take your words seriously anymore. So you really, if you want to actually retain and grow your employees, then you actually have to take the actions behind them as well. And sooner rather than later, otherwise they're going to feel like you're just dragging them along with nothing behind it necessarily.
And Emmanuelle, I'm curious. Like I asked Alex about some of the more quantitative measures of success and ROI for coaching, and you started to touch on some of these in your last response. But just in your experience, what qualitative changes have you observed in employees who have access to personalized coaching, and how do these changes impact their resilience, engagement, and just overall career growth?
I've seen a big impact on resilience overall, just because it's coaching also provides a safe space. And sometimes there's a perception that it's not healthy to vent. We don't want to add to the gossip or anything like that. But there's sometimes there can be a lot of emotions that we also at work that we also need to work through so that we can better respond and be our best selves rather than react in the moment. And so I've seen discussions evolve in the organization as a result, and people be a lot more solution oriented as part of organizational change, for instance. So I think that has been maybe more of a qualitative metric, but something that I've seen evolve as well. And I think in general that also drives engagement as employees feel that they're part of the solution and general retention. And of course, as we look at specific progress on skill sets, there are things that we can measure in terms of where they were and where we want them to, where they want to be, and the progress that's being made. So that's more specific to each individual.
Yeah, and I love that you led with resilience. That's a pretty core part of Boon's business is we measure resilience for every employee that works with our coach. And I remember when I started at Boon, I kind of thought like, well, how do you measure resilience and what does that even mean? And, I think what I've learned over time is there's been so much research that correlates resilience to things like someone's job performance and job satisfaction and even organizational loyalty when we're talking about things like retention. And then I think just more broadly and more generally, when we think about these fast-paced work environments or really any work environment where change is kind of the only constant in a lot of these settings, resilience is just such a core skill that's required to be able to navigate that change. So yeah, love that that's where we started there. And kind of along those lines, just from a broader sense of resilience, Alex, I'm curious, what are some core elements of a resilient growth infrastructure that can withstand rapid change and unpredictable challenges? And how do you ensure that personalized growth initiatives remain adaptable and scalable in that environment?
And sometimes I think the word resilient gets thrown around a little too much, but that's just me. I think that, it goes back to one of my favorite words that I use on the daily is flexibility. And so you need to have flexible systems, but also clear principles, and I think if you're kind of working from nothing, part of that is developing that foundation. And so within that foundation, you got to think about, do you have clear competency frameworks that actually have measurable outcomes? Do you have a technology platform that supports how you document and track the sort of any sort of growth outcomes? Are you doing regular calibration across departments around this? Do you have like a skills list that evolves as the business changes? Like, that is where you need to be starting off from as a baseline, because then everything comes from there, right? From there, you can think about, you asked about like any adaptable components, right? Which could be, I talked about like cross-functional projects, so I mentioned peer learning networks, and then I think for personalization, in order to not lose that, you do need to think about, I think Emmanuelle touched on toolkits before, like manager toolkits for customizing development plans as well, so that they're more specific. I think I've been a big fan of self-directed. I know not everyone might feel that way, but I've been a fan of it. And then also I've learned, especially in my last few organizations, that choice in your learning formats and your pace, right? I talked about like micro learnings and stuff like that, depending on what kind of business you have. And a lot of businesses are cyclical and they have busy seasons. And so, having different learning formats is going to be really important. And also any feedback loops as well, I think is really key too. So those are the things that stand out for me.
Yeah. And I think that in terms of flexibility, acknowledging that everyone is going to learn differently, both in terms of the formats that resonate with them, but also the pace at which they are looking to or capable of developing at. So I think that acknowledgement is part of how you kind of set the framework for the rest of that flexibility moving forward. So and Emmanuelle, the last question for you, and also just as a heads up to the chat, we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, anything that we haven't covered, or anything that you would like Emmanuelle and Alex to expand on, throw it in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we start to work through those. But Emmanuelle, for companies that may not have the Uber and Alibaba budgets and resources available at their disposal, but still need these agile growth models, what practical steps can they take to implement flexible, high-impact development practices? And are there any lessons that you learn from those organizations that could still be applied to smaller or mid-sized organizations?
So I think that, and going back to, let's say, in particular, Alibaba, where maybe the means were not necessarily there locally at the time. I think what works really well is a very close partnership between the business leadership team and the HR leadership to make sure that those two are constantly talking and working together. It shouldn't be just on one of the teams. This is really a joint work that needs to be done. There needs to be a clear prioritization of the issues. So where are the gaps in the organization and in the processes? And then we can start plugging away at them with a roadmap. So I think that continuing to maintain competencies is absolutely key, and that's actually something that gets overlooked very, very often. But we can't do much more if we don't have that piece in place. I was a very big fan of the cross-functional project assignments, especially they're actually trying to solve a business problem, and they're not just to make people feel good, but there's good work to be done. Because I think that will also allow employees to build their network within the organization, to expand their horizons, to pick up new skills, and to see how their skills will translate to other things. So I think that piece was really key. And today we still say that 70% of the job, right, learning is done through actual assignments. So I think that's key. And then starting to reflect on some of these trainings, even when it comes to business acumen, how do we provide context for that? How do we give people the right exposure? How do we do exercises around communication, stakeholder management, and so on? And that's where business leaders within the organization can also help to take a role, have a role in this, or otherwise rely on external partners to help them do that. But going to a more personalized direction is obviously over time key, but we probably still first need to have that foundational infrastructure in place before we can go there.
Yeah. And I just, again, I keep coming back to the core competency because it really kind of serves as the roadmap for the rest of the plan, where we talk about these flexible structures and people learning and preferring different mediums of how they're absorbing that information and development. But at the end of the day, if there's not that North Star of these are the areas that we need to prioritize and focus on and align on as a business, it kind of feels like you're flying blindly, where you're not really sure what you're building as you're building it without that roadmap in place.
Well, it's like anything. You need to know what you're solving for, right? And so that allows us to diagnose the gaps both at the organizational and individual level that we want to work on.
I think from our end of things, just want to thank everyone again for taking time out of your day and engaging in this important conversation about transforming employee development. I know we covered a lot, from limitations of quick fixes to the need for real alignment between development strategies and business goals. We hope you're walking away from today's session with some practical insights to help reimagine and really strengthen your organization's development strategies. It also looks like we have one more question before I give us our final wrap up. So any suggestions for strong and effective one-on-ones, peer-to-peer, manager to direct report, other?
Emmanuelle, you want to go first?
I'm a big fan of giving them structure. I think that we need to ensure that they're wonderful for team building, right? To connect with individual. We all see the benefits of connection at work, but I think that sometimes there are too many one-on-ones that are not productive from a work or development perspective. So I like to be very clear about what we need to touch on. And so maybe even distinguish between any topics that are more operational and updates, and maybe even having a running doc that's updated. So we don't spend time giving each other updates, but rather discussing their implications, making decisions, and then addressing roadblocks. And so to me, that's important. It's important to keep them personalized. So of course, having that personalized check-in and checking on each other is key. And when we're mostly remote, of course, that can't necessarily be done by the coffee machine. It needs to be a part of the discussion and should be. But we need to go beyond that and see how someone is truly feeling about things at that moment.
Did Emmanuelle knock it out of the park, or do you have anything to add to that, Alex?
She did. I was like, I'm plus 100 on all of it. I think the only things I'll add is one thing I think that's evolved for me with definitely check-ins with direct reports in the last couple of years in particular, starting with a well-being check-in. I think that there's so much going on in people's lives, the shift in terms of how we live our life. I think that starting with that is so important. I agree wholeheartedly also with the priorities and blockers. What I always say is people can get lost sometimes in how much work that is on their plate and lose sight of what's the most important thing that they need to be doing. I coach people on this a lot myself, and I say focus. You as a manager need to help prioritize their priorities to make sure they're not working on busy work that isn't actually of add value to the business. And then also discussing their growth and development is going to be really important. That doesn't need to happen on every one-on-one, but it should at very least be happening periodically if you want to put actions behind the words like we talked about before. And then for peer-to-peer, I think it's really useful if peers come together to share challenges and learnings, because it feels less isolating if they do that. They might feel alone, like they're the only one if they're not. And offering mutual feedback and insights as well, because sometimes otherwise it just comes down to the manager to giving those feedback and insights. But I think there's so much to be learned and shared in peer-to-peer feedback as well. So those are the only things I would.
That's something we did a lot of in peer one-on-ones at Uber, is to share, okay, what did I see that was great? And maybe is there an opportunity, something you could have done differently? That was very powerful. It's okay not to do it every single one-on-one, so it doesn't feel forced. Yet I think that helps us to go into the direction of real-time feedback, which is sometimes it can be hard to get sometimes.
Yeah. And to that end, I would also just add, as far as giving and receiving feedback, like whether it's in a manager or peer situation, I usually now also start by saying, are you in a space to receive feedback, for example, because I know in general we like to say feedback is a gift, but if your feedback cup is full that day, you might not be ready for more. So I think maybe starting with that, and if they say, hey, actually today's not the best, then circle back during the next one-on-one.
I also think something that you touched on, Alex, that we could probably do a whole nother session on is you mentioned the mental well-being check-in at the start of every one-on-one. And I think as we have these conversations about professional growth in the workplace, oftentimes that personal side of the development equation gets overlooked, where, if people have things that are going on outside of work in their own personal lives, they're stressed, they're burnt out, they're overwhelmed, that's going to impact the way that they're able to develop and prioritize development, no matter what infrastructure is in place. And so I think acknowledging the role that the personal and the human side plays into that is key, especially at the leadership level, where oftentimes managers kind of get thrown into that role of being the team therapist or coach, or they are that resource that is there to support their direct reports, but they also have their own stuff going on, their own personal challenges or whatever that may be. And so just really acknowledging the role that plays in someone's ability to grow, I think is a great call out.
Yeah. And I think to your point, like it is about acknowledgement. Like, the individual isn't looking for the manager to solve that, but it's just acknowledging that there is other stuff going on in their life beyond, their priorities that they're working on as well. That can go a long way in that relationship as well.
Yep. Well, that I believe that wraps up our questions. So appreciate. We actually just had a great comment in the chat. Are you in a space to receive feedback? This is beautiful. So I think we've got some good takeaways there. But again, Emmanuelle, Alex, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughtful insights today. We appreciate you joining us. Appreciate everyone who took time out of their day, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Boon panel discussion soon to come. But thanks, everyone.